Everyone, thanks for joining us today. This is our next edition in our webinar series, Blue Carbon in Practice. And today we're joined by the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration to learn about a new tool for accounting for blue carbon in restoration. All right, you should be seeing slides up on your screen now, and please let me know if you don't see anything by typing in your chat box. Everyone has been placed in listen-only mode, so if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can enter it into the question chat box. Our speakers will be taking questions at the end of this webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be posted online at www.estuaries.org. We also will have a brief 3-question survey, which you will be prompted to answer at the end of the webinar. We appreciate your feedback and ideas for future webinars so we can continue to provide you with blue carbon information you need. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, I want to introduce you to our speakers today. My name is Stephanie Simpson. I am the Blue Carbon Program Manager at Restore America's Estuaries, and will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. And I'm happy to introduce our guest speakers today. We'll hear from Tim Purinton, the Director of the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game's Division of Ecological Restoration, which was created in 2009 to meet the need for statewide ecological-based restoration program. Tim will be joined by Nick Wildman, who is a restoration specialist for the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. Nick is a project manager on 8 restoration projects and leads the division's research on economic impacts of ecological restoration. Before I hand it off to Tim and Nick, I want to give you a little background on this webinar series. This is part of our Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series as part of Restore America's Estuaries Blue Carbon Initiative. For those not familiar with us, Restore America's Estuaries, we are a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of our nation's bays and estuaries as essential natural resources. And we lead an alliance of 10 conservation organizations across the coast. We're located just outside of Washington, D.C., and we provide a united voice for coastal conservation in the nation's capital, advancing science and understanding, and restoring estuaries through on-the-ground projects. We also convene a national summit every 2 years, the largest gathering of the coastal restoration and management community. And this year, the conference is happening in December in New Orleans. We have a lot of really engaging topics and presenters, including a mini track of blue carbon sessions. I hope you'll be joining us in December, and so I just wanted to give a quick reminder that registration is open and that early bird rates are ending October 31st, and that you can register online at estuaries.org/summit. So back to the topic at hand, blue carbon. A quick review for those new to this topic. When we say blue carbon, we are referring to the greenhouse gases stored in, sequestered by, and released by coastal marine ecosystems, including salt marsh, seagrass, mangroves, and other tidal wetlands. We know that these ecosystems are extremely efficient at taking up and storing carbon in their soils, where it can remain locked up for centuries or more, as long as the habitat remains protected. As these habitats are drained or degraded, that stored carbon can be released back into the atmosphere, so the protection and restoration of these habitats can not only aid in climate mitigation, but it also provides the many other important ecosystem services we know that they provide. So if blue carbon is still a really new topic for you, or you're looking to learn more, you can check out our Blue Carbon website, which includes additional resources and publications, as well as past webinar recordings, including an introductory webinar on blue carbon. There's also a link there to sign up for our monthly Blue Carbon Buzz e-newsletter, which is a great way to stay up to date on blue carbon news, publication events, and future webinars. And you can sign up at estuaries.org/bluecarbon. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and pass control over to Tim and Nick. Tim and Nick, are you on the line?
We're here. We're just setting up here.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that that kind introduction and for setting the stage for blue carbon. And so what I wanted to just let people, remind people, because I know that as part of the webinar there was a link which you can click into and you can download some of the materials that we have on our website, including a fact sheet on the blue carbon calculator, sort of the backbone, the methodology report. There is also the Excel spreadsheet, the calculator, which my colleague Nick will run through in some detail during this webinar. And if you didn't see the link, just Google Mass Blue Carbon Calculator. That should bring you where you need to be. And you can do it now, and you can maybe even have it kind of running in the background, and then you can follow along a little bit more clearly when Nick starts his piece. So again, thanks so much. Again, I'm Tim Purinton, and I coordinate the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. And both Nick and I and some other colleagues here have really been interested in looking at what the ecosystem service benefits are for our ecological restoration projects. And so the Blue Carbon Calculator is sort of just one in a series of other ecosystem service quantification efforts that we've done. And what we've really found is that it's been a very, as I will talk about later, it's been a very interesting kind of tool to enter into new conversations and to kind of raise the profile of the work that we do, ecological restoration. So it's a, in a way, once you start to bring shape or see the benefits of quantifying blue carbon benefits, just different opportunities and different policy avenues start to open. So again, we are a small agency within the Department of Fish and Game that's dedicated to restoring primarily aquatic ecosystems, and we work almost 100% on proactive ecological restoration activities. So we're not part of a mitigation program. We're part of the regulatory structure of state government. And again, we're nested in state government, so we have a very good sort of view both up towards the federal folks and then down to the municipal local level. So we're very well situated to advance ecological restoration in a state where there's a lot of opportunities due to our land use history and both our geography, in the sense that we have a lot of coastal wetland resources as well as inland. What's really exciting about again, thinking about blue carbon and the associated restoration of coastal ecosystems is that once you start to understand the benefits of blue carbon, you can start to enter into conversations, especially around the salt marsh restoration side, as both a tool for mitigating in terms of, and again, we'll start to look at some of the greenhouse gas budgeting on some of these restoration projects, but also we all know that strong, healthy, resilient coastal ecosystems are great adaptation strategies in terms of buffering storms and flood attenuation and water quality benefits. And so again, what's really interesting about this, about advancing our understanding on blue carbon, is you can get yourself well situated into discussions both on the adaptation and the mitigation for climate change. We really look at, and Nick will kind of explain in more detail some of our restoration approaches here in Massachusetts, but we really follow Society for Ecological Restoration's definition of what is restoration, where we're really looking at restoring natural processes, removing the primary ecosystem stressors, and increasing resiliency, sort of trending away from hard engineering and sort of for the benefit of long-term self-sustaining ecosystems. We have about 60 ongoing projects both in the coastal zone as well as in the inland area. We do a lot of dam removal projects. We've done about 40 dam removal projects. And it's interesting that the Blue Carbon Calculator starts to give us information on that type of activity as well as a salt marsh restoration project. So we can start to look at the changes in terms of land cover types, and in particular wetland cover types, and plug them into the calculator, as you will see, and get a better understanding of greenhouse gas budgeting. We do a lot of work on former degraded ag lands, in particular cranberry farms, and so you'll see there's a large focus on just to the nature of our geography in the southeast of Massachusetts on former cranberry bogs. And we've run our cranberry bog projects through the Blue Carbon Calculator as well. And you'll see those in the report if you download the report. So that's also kind of an interesting way into looking at, again, the greenhouse gas impacts, one ecosystem service of some of the work that we're advancing. And again, our work is not done alone. It's done in partnerships with NGOs as well as federal folks, and including people on this webinar who might be partners with us. So Stephanie talked about blue carbon. One thing, so this is just one slide on blue carbon. This is really, I think, the most important thing to point out is that the restoration of coastal habitats not only stores carbon, but reduces methane. And methane, as folks know, is a very potent global warming greenhouse gas, 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide, although its residence time is shorter than carbon dioxide. Again, it's a lot of the benefits that we see, especially on the coastal side, is in reduction of methane. And again, I want to stress that the Blue Carbon Calculator is it's sort of half of the picture. It's just on the emission side. It's not on the sequestration side. And so it's just a look into the greenhouse gas budgeting on emissions, not sequestration. But we do have some information on sequestration that we can highlight. But that's another sort of growth opportunity as the calculator is developed. So Nick is going to run through this, but essentially the calculator is built on a land use change, a land cover type. What are your land cover types? And then the emissions resulting from those land cover type shifts or changes are calculated in this Excel spreadsheet. And they're built off of, and Nick will explain this, the IPCC wetland supplement data, which is a global assessment of wetland emissions. And again, really what you need to know, and Nick's going to walk through the more specific variables, but is really what are you changing in terms of land area. And the calculator looks out to about 50 years. And so, again, that's a short window when we're thinking about the long-term trajectory of coastal or even freshwater wetland restoration projects. We do a lot of Atlantic white cedar projects, and we know that Atlantic white cedar swamps take hundreds, if not thousands of years to fully mature. So again, this is a very slim slice into the overall greenhouse gas budgeting for ecological restoration project. And we have 4 outputs that you can see in terms of the way we calculate emissions. And again, Nick will talk about that in some more detail. I'm just going to quickly run through sort of a typical project, and then we'll get into more detail a little bit later. But this is sort of a standard ecological restoration, coastal ecological restoration project in Massachusetts. We've done about 50 of these projects. About 2,000 acres of coastal wetland have been restored. This is Dam Meadows in Hingham, which is just south of Boston, Massachusetts. And this is about a 20-acre site that was converted from a brackish freshwater wetland system into, and you can see the small culvert at the bottom of your screen, into a site that has free tidal exchange, that has a combination of mudflats and high marsh and low marsh, salt marsh. So, and again, Nick is going to walk through the information, but this is what the calculator looks like. You enter your data, and again, Nick will walk you through this, and you get your outputs. So this is the way you can display the information. And one of the things that we really wanted to add, which is very common, obviously, in these types of applications, is the greenhouse gas emission reductions in terms of gallons of gasoline equivalents. And that's important for us in terms of demonstrating or making more tangible the information to policymakers and to folks that may not have the same sort of scientific background that many of you may have. So again, trying to convey this information in ways that are accessible and approachable to decision makers. So again, one of the things that another way to articulate the benefits is, again, looking at the emission benefits. And in this case, we converted mostly a wetland system that was dominated by Phragmites australis, or common reed, to a salt marsh system. And there, the real benefits came in the CH4 or methane emission reductions that are typical of more freshwater systems. And it is estimated it's about 1,000 fewer tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere, which is equivalent to about 100,000 gallons of gasoline. Again, that's over a 50-year time period. Just by chance, and this is not something that the calculator will actually give you, we actually looked at the sequestration benefits of this site through another contract with ICF International, and we found that that the benefits in terms of the carbon sequestration in the healthy salt marsh soils was equivalent to about 3,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. And if you apply the social cost of carbon to that, that equivalent can be then translated into dollars, in this case around $100,000, and in terms of gallons of gasoline. So in this site, Dan Meadows and Hingham, we actually have the benefits of looking at both the emission benefits and the sequestration benefits. Just to stress, though, that the calculator is focused 100% on the emission side, but we wanted to just show you this information just because, again, it underscores the real benefits of coastal wetland restoration, both in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction, primarily methane in this case, as well as sequestration. So I turn it over to Nick Wildman.
Well, for this part, I'd like to talk just a little bit about how this thing is built, more or less. As you may know, in 2006, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued guidelines for developing greenhouse gas inventories for nations across the globe. That guidance covered things like energy production, industrial activities, waste management, and land use. Wetlands are part of land use, and so it wasn't until 2013 that this supplement was issued, which basically contains a much more thorough discussion of wetland functions and their contributions under a number of different activities and impacts, their contribution to greenhouse gas inventories. As you dig into the supplement, what we understand is that the IPCC divides their guidance up into different tiers of data specificity. We're working here really on the ground floor, tier 1. These are basically scientific consensus-based estimates for carbon emissions for different parts of the globe based on different activities. Tier 2 would be where you would get more specific to a country, or in the case of a nation as large as ours, maybe regional specific. You might have developed regional specific emissions factors for, say, mangroves in the Gulf Coast or northeast or northwest salt marshes, something a little more specific like that. And tier 3 refers to very robust analysis, very site-specific analysis mostly. So we're, again, at the ground floor. We're working with tier 1 estimates, and those are important because those were the ones that were picked up by our state in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. So again, as a state agency, we wanted to make sure this work for us was most relevant to our constituents and the decision makers here. So working from the IPCC supplement, we had to make several translations or conversions. First of all, being here in the United States, we're very used to working in English measurements. Our GIS systems across the state agencies are based in English systems for the most part, and the IPCC information is in metric. So as you'll see when we play with the calculator a bit later, there is some conversion back and forth there. Also, again, in order to keep relevant to our constituents and to our sister divisions and managers working in the wetlands realm, we translated the IPCC land use categories to land use categories or cover types that are common and in use for managers here in Massachusetts. So you'll see that a little bit when we dig into the tool very shortly here. So I'm very glad to see how many folks have been very curious about this tool since we rolled it out earlier this year. And I know that the use of it has ranged quite widely, but mostly folks are just checking this out. And as a user, what is it, you may be wondering, do I need to know to get going here? there are 5 different inputs or 5 different parameters that you as the user can change here. I guess I should say that obviously the tool is an Excel-based workbook, and so is very easy to modify. And we're hoping that folks will take that and either working with us or our partners or on their own, look to use this as a very simple launching pad for more specific measurements. The inputs that you'll have control over as a user are salinity, whether a site has fresh or salt water, activity type, that is what's going on the land here, the acreage of that cover type, and maybe how that changes based on your activity. You also need to understand whether your soils are organic or mineral. Obviously, the amount of free and available labile carbon is important, and that's going to vary from site to site. Even here in a small state like Massachusetts, we find different soil types and want to be sensitive to that. I should say, though, that we don't have too much, well, there is quite wide nutrient levels, but in general, our wetlands and waterways tend to fall on the nutrient-rich side of things, but you'll notice that, and we'll talk a bit about how that is selected for in the calculator. Salinity is obviously important because of the chemical changes that go on with soil organisms that are respirating in the soil under different anaerobic conditions. Now, the main change that we see very often is either going from an aerobic condition, that is an upland condition, converting that to wetlands through a rewetting activity, or from changes from a freshwater environment to saltwater. Reaching back to Tim's example from dammed meadows in Hingham, that's a perfect example of how reintroducing saltwater brings with it a large component of sulfur, which is obviously more energetically preferred for those soil microorganisms. And so by reintroducing that sulfur, you cut off the methane pump that would otherwise be going on and that we see in freshwater wetlands. So entering into the calculator, it's important to understand both the pre and post activity conditions as far as salinity. The wetland supplement, the 2016 wetland supplement, or 13, excuse me, covered 3 different activities: drainage and extraction. Extraction means where you're extracting peat-based soils from wetlands. And then also rewetting, that would be flooding old wetlands or flooding uplands in some kind of wetland creation system. As Tim mentioned, most of our work at DER in our division is maybe rewetting, but also quite a bit of it is wetlands transitioning to other types of wetlands, more either geographically appropriate or historically or ecologically valuable wetlands. In general, these changes could be man-made or they could be natural, but those are the 4 different activities that you can choose from as a user. Next, you'll need to know the acreage. The calculator is set up for acres, but it draws from hectare-based emissions factors. So depending on your which of those 4 activities is going on, you'll need to input that acreage accordingly. So in the pictures you see on the left, a cranberry farm or part of a cranberry farm that we worked on with partners to restore to a much more appropriate fen type wetland with a stream running through the middle, as you see on the right there. So in that case, you would use, the acreage can come from remote sensing activities or it can come from direct field measurements of those different cover types. In terms of selecting whether your soil is, quote, organic or mineral soil, the IPCC does state breakpoints or parameters, thresholds for for those 2 selections. For folks using this tool in the United States, using the USDA's soil survey outputs for your given study area is probably going to be the most efficient and easiest way to go. Depending on the soil order or suborder, you can identify whether you're you're impacting organic or mineral soils if you don't have actual site data. Now, nutrients are important, as many of you know, partly because of their effect on the carbon cycle and carbon and respiration in the soils, but also certainly because of the production of nitrous oxide. And what we're seeing more and more in the research, especially of our coastal wetlands, where we have pretty intensive anthropogenic nitrogen sources, is that those are becoming, in some cases, very substantial emitters of nitrous oxide, but certainly in all cases, a very wide-ranging outputs of nitrous oxide. Our tool right now is basically agnostic to nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases besides carbon dioxide and methane. But all that to say, the calculator, as you'll see, defaults to a nutrient-rich situation, but you can set it for nutrient poor, which would be appropriate for our users that are working in boreal applications in higher latitudes, or perhaps in very pristine watersheds where we don't have that. And so it'll be interesting. It may be interesting, depending on your cover type, to perform a little sensitivity analysis and run those both ways to see how that impacts your outputs. So at the bottom of the map here is dammed meadows. You can see just south of Boston. That was the quick example that Tim showed. Similar site I'll show now, to refresh your memory, is located north of Boston, up near our border with the state of New Hampshire, a place called Town Creek, which is in the town of Salisbury. And what you see here is a zoom in. The Atlantic Ocean is off to the right. This is the tidal Merrimack River coming in, moving from right to left. And we have Town Creek entering from this side. And what you see is a very large salt marsh, saltgrass dominated salt marsh here that is partially cut off by a rail line. This is a railroad link here west of Route 1, which is a major road running north and south. This railroad had a failed tide gate on it that was basically non-functioning. It allowed it basically was non-functioning, quite frankly, and so that was a problem both for the health of this. We got about 60 plus acres of salt marsh in behind or up gradient from the rail line. There's a problem for the health of that wetland, but also for flooding impacts along this very busy retail and industrial corridor of Route 1. So in, I think it was 2013, we partnered with local and state and federal agencies to reinstall a state-of-the-art tide gate that could be manipulated in advance of storm events to protect these properties, but also be allowed to remain open to restore that tidal flushing to the 60-odd acres. Very similar to our Dam Meadow site, by reintroducing the saltwater flow to the site, this is just as we began construction, by reintroducing the saltwater flow to that site, we basically eliminated the methane production and showed an exceptional reduction in the greenhouse gas carbon CO2 equivalents released to the atmosphere. Now again, we're looking just at soil emissions here. We're not looking at carbon sequestration or uptake, just the emissions from the soil. So we're based on the calculator, we have over 12,000 fewer tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere, which is about equal to 1.1 million fewer gallons of gasoline burned over 50 years. All of our outputs are linear based on the simplicity of the model and extrapolate out about 50 years. So that's another good illustrative example of how that works. I'd like to transition now to, I'm going to shift my screen to bring up the tool, and you can follow along with me if you like. If you want to, as I'm talking, kind of do this stuff on your own, that would be fine too. We're going to spend 5 to 10 minutes, I think, just walking you through the mechanics of the tool. Oh, so bear with me just a second here. Shift. Okay. So when you open up the workbook, the first thing you'll notice is this is a basic Excel-based workbook. And I should say that depending on which version of your software that you're running or other considerations, you may need to click a box that says Enable Content that would show up near the top. That's going to allow Microsoft Excel to run the macros and the calculations that the workbook does. So if you do see that come up, or you start to jump right in and play around with it and don't get results, that's because you haven't enabled the content. So we have a series of tabs at the bottom, like all workbooks, and the leftmost, the first one, is Instructions. So after this webinar is over, this provides sort of a decision tree-based approach to kind of how you would use the calculator. The next most important tab certainly is the data entry. And here, we'll talk about this in just a minute. Here's where you enter your acreages for the different 1, 2, 3, 4 different kinds of wetland changes or activities. And those are translated over to the right to hectares, basically reaching back to the IPCC information. I'll talk about some of these other tabs. These are the activity tabs, where those emissions factors are translated for those specific activities. And all those factors are drawn by the lookup table. All the way to the right, as you can see, is what we call the lookup table. This takes the land use categories from the wetland supplement, and for each of the activities, out a table for those emissions factors. So that is the changes in tons of carbon-based greenhouse gases for those. Your results will come out on the Results tab, which we'll play with and I'll demonstrate in just a minute. And then, of course, we have a Reset button, which was a great addition, I think, because it allows you to clear the screen, clear the decks, and start over. The tabs, as you'll see, draw from the lookup table for the different activities. So extraction, drainage, rewetting, or a conversion from wetlands pre-project to post-project. So again, hopefully you'll find this very interesting. I think what we should do is work through a very quick example, borrowing from the dammed meadows or Town Creek examples Tim and I talked about, just to show you the mechanics of how this worked. So let's talk again about Town Creek in Salisbury, if you remember that. We had a Phragmites dominated wetland. The native Spartinas had over the years been replaced very heavily by invasive Phragmites, and we had approximately 60 acres of that condition. So here's where we are in the
it's in the wrong category.
Sorry, yep. Let me clear that out. So I'm putting this in the prior column, and I don't have the actual numbers from our survey here, but let's say we maintained, let's say we maintained an acre of Phragmites dominated wetland up in the very freshwater uppermost extents of that area, and then had about, let's just go round numbers here and say we had 29 acres of high marsh and another 30 of low marsh as a result of that. Now notice, inland, so the first thing you notice as you're selecting where to put these things is whether the whether the site is located inland, that is freshwater, or coastal, that is saltwater. I'm choosing organics here. I'm choosing the organic versus mineral option here because this site was just, as many flow restricted wetlands tend to be, a high accumulation of mucks and peat that can change very dramatically depending on the part of our state that you're in. I'm sure where you work there's variation in that, both due to the geology but also due to the historic land use. So okay, very simple round numbers, 60 acres of frag-dominated wetland. We're going to keep a little frag in there, but we mainly transition to a classic high and low marsh, salt marsh that you see typical of New England. Note that in the box, the gray box down here, you can enter a project name. So we'll go ahead and do that. If I can spell. And then we're going to hit complete, and that begins to run the numbers. Now, notice by hitting complete, it's taken us to the Wetlands to Wetlands calculator page or tab. Here's where we see the acreages that we entered, translated into hectares, and then carried through the math carried through from using the IPCC emissions factors. The top box here is for pre-project, and the bottom is for post-project. In both cases, I'm going to leave the default selection for unknown nutrient status. In this case, I think it should be nutrient rich because of the residential and business uses in that watershed. But keep in mind, leaving it as unknown defaults to nutrient rich. So we're essentially running this as a nutrient rich condition. Once I'm satisfied with that, I'm not touching anything in these boxes. I'm going to hit complete, and that's going to take us here to the results table. So here's what we see here. Again, having made up those acreages off the top of my head, they don't correspond exactly to what I said on that previous slide as far as the outputs. But at the top you see we have our emissions reductions table. We're focused on the remaining wetlands area where you can see the changes here. And in all cases we see a reduction both in the methane carbon, the carbon dioxide equivalents, as well as the gallons of gasoline equivalents. What's cool about this, I think, is that each of our little boxes here, each of our little figures has the project name in there now, Town Creek. And you'll notice, on a technical side, you'll notice these are all linear. That is based on a simple assumption, based on, I guess, simple mathematics that we have to work with here. The scientists in the audience will probably be the first to say, well, certainly those chemical transformations may be relatively instantaneous, but those emissions certainly aren't going to ramp up to, those exact outputs in the first few years. And so I think what you might be more comfortable seeing is something that reflected a more logical time change on that. But again, we're basically taking the IPCC Tier 1 data and multiplying that out across the 50-year time horizon. Okay. So that was a very concrete example. I'll hit reset to clear us out. It brings us back to the data entry page. Let me show you a different aspect. So that was wetlands, remaining wetlands. We went from one wetland type to a few different kinds. In some cases, you may be looking at policies or projects that would restore wetlands by removing fill, for instance, or restoring the hydrology to a wetland. In those cases, you're going to want to use the rewetting column. That's going to draw on data from the rewetting data from the IPCC supplement. But let's say we're working on an inland site. We're working somewhere away from the coast, and we have, well, let's say we're going to restore, let's say we're taking, this is one we use sometimes for a cranberry farm. Cranberry farms in the southeast of Massachusetts are generally founded on very sandy, outwash plain soils, and so are generally meet the mineral description. Let's see what happens if we were to say, restore the hydrology to an old, out-of-production cranberry farm of 100 acres. Now, we're not going to do anything over here. We're not transitioning these. We're not bringing in machines to muck up the soils or to change anything. We're just going to say, by reestablishing the hydrology there, we're going to somehow bring it back to the typical fen-type wet meadow ecosystem that many of those were historically. We're going to give this a new name. We're going to call it cranberry, or cran for short, and we're going to hit complete. Automatically, we're brought to our rewetting calculator. You'll notice here we only have one box because we don't have a pre and post comparison to make. And let's just say we're going to leave it as unknown because, again, that defaults to nutrient rich. We're going to say we have lots of legacy nutrients from the farming operation, as well as nutrients leaching in from the surrounding land use. And we'll hit complete. Now notice this trend. We may not be too excited to see this trend. This is why I chose this example. What we're seeing both in the table and in these figures is that we have an increase in carbon dioxide and carbon equivalents released here. Mainly methane. That's simply because we've rewetted, we've reintroduced an anaerobic condition to these soils that we've assumed are that were aerobic before. And so what you see is an increase, or over 50 years, the equivalent of more greenhouse gases being produced. So this kind of, I show these two different examples because it speaks to how we're using this tool to kind of look at the portfolio, the overall portfolio of this one aspect of our work. Obviously, restoring a cranberry bog or a tidal wetland or anything like that has multiple benefits, ecological and social benefits. But this is kind of an illustration how this very simple tool might look at two different restoration, well-intentioned restoration activities, but through a different lens as related to greenhouse gases. So I encourage you to play around with this and look for ways to improve this. I will say that we presented this to some friends in the Gulf Coast region of the U.S., down in Texas, where mangroves are an important part of their thinking of wetland processes and restoration. And within about 30 minutes, I was able to update, using the IPCC numbers, update the table here on the Lookup Table, the data entry table, and the associated activity tables within about 30 minutes to add in a functional way to compare mangroves. So if I can do that in 30 minutes, I'm sure many of you on the call can do even more than that with just a little bit of muscle. So I know that's very short. I think we need to, for time reasons, we're going to switch back to our presentation and wrap up with a few more slides, and then we can take more questions on that, certainly.
Thanks so much, Nick. And I think that really it's important to stress that this is just a sort of, as Nick calls it, a launching pad, that the information can be tailored for your own use. You can put in regional specific data. We're excited because we're working on a couple sites where we're going to get very site-specific information that we can enter into the sort of the tier 3 category. So again, this is a first generation tool. It's rough, but we hope that we can start to build on it to help kind of put more flesh on the bone. So what does this all mean from a policy and planning perspective? And so there are so many different applications and that we're really excited about. Obviously, we primarily work on the right-hand column on the non-regulatory side in terms of advancing ecological restoration. We can definitely look at this in terms of land protection benefits, in terms of especially looking at protecting areas where salt marshes might migrate. Again, we here in Massachusetts have both a climate change action plan for mitigation as well as an adaptation plan. And again, advancing some of these restoration projects as both adaptation and resiliency approaches is really important, and it's gaining some traction. What I'm interested in too is just internally, we have again a portfolio of 60 active projects. We may not actually, have this be part of sort of an external. It may be more of an internal accounting of the way we do work. Again, as Nick presented, we do a lot of freshwater wetland restoration projects. We may feel like we need to offset some of those by continuing to do a strong stable of coastal wetland projects so we can offset our own internal restoration practices. Another thing that's starting to emerge and that Restore America's Estuaries has been very active in is starting to think about the sale or transfer of some of these carbon credits. And we're, as I'll mention in the next slide, we are looking to pilot this at Herring River, one of our largest coastal wetland restoration projects down in Cape Cod. If you flip over to the regulatory side, obviously both in terms of the wetlands protection and wetlands mitigation, as we start to learn about this function and value, we can start to think about how best to replace those functions and values, and both on the mitigation again and on the protection side. What's really exciting here in Massachusetts is we just developed, as part of our Global Warming Solutions Act, pretty aggressive greenhouse gas mitigation targets. Our goal is to reduce by 25% our emissions by 2020, and the state's looking at some of our wetland restoration projects as helping to meet those targets. And also there's a couple platforms by which greenhouse gas offsets activities can count towards, in our case, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Coastal wetland restoration is not part of the greenhouse gas offsets. There are certain upland forestry protection that is, but the hope is that as we learn more and we get more information on this, that it could potentially be integrated into the greenhouse gas regional efforts. So one thing to really stress is that this is just one ecosystem service benefit, and we always have to remind ourselves that we're looking at multiple ecosystem services. It may be that in our freshwater wetland system we're increasing methane, but we're also protecting rare species, or we might be improving water quality. So again, we have to look at the full complement of ecosystem services. If you just look at this narrowly, you can get kind of, I guess, maybe sidetracked a little bit in terms of why we do these projects. Again, just a rough screening tool. As mentioned, we're really excited to work with Restore America's Estuaries, Terra Carbon, and some of our other partners to look at seeing if we can bring to market some of these carbon benefits at the Herring River restoration. And one of the things, again, we're really looking at is ways that, as this ecosystem service can be quantified, how we look at and prioritize future restoration actions. So again, I think at this point, it's really the most valuable aspect of this tool is for our own internal planning and prioritization of our resources. And then finally, what's exciting is in California, under their climate action approach, they're starting to fund wetland restoration projects that have blue carbon benefits. So we're starting to see this materialize. We're not quite there yet here in Massachusetts, but again, our colleagues in California could probably speak more to this, but we're excited to see that, again, some of these on-the-ground wetland restoration activities are starting to be incorporated into a Commonwealth's or a state's climate action plan.
From a technical side, I think I hit on some of the limitations of the tool, and we're very eager to hopefully have folks from the scientific community take up continued use and testing of the project. If we could get to use some very simple modifications to the tool, could reflect a more realistic change in the dynamics of those carbon outputs rather than be a linear function displayed. The IPCC data is not very great for open water, ponds and lakes. It doesn't have great function or emissions factors for those, nor for some of the upland soils. So really kind of understanding those trade-offs better would be excellent. Obviously, we're learning a lot about nitrous oxide dynamics in nutrient-enriched wetlands, which we have very many of here in our part of the world. I'd love to incorporate some parts of that, as well as just simply work with scientists on regional or local tier 2 or tier 3 level data to really make this more specific to where we work and what we're the things we're trying to move the needle on, so to speak. Again, we're really, with this tool, just looking at soil emissions data. As Tim mentioned, there you can kind of back into or use other efforts to incorporate sequestration, but certainly the Excel-based tool is malleable enough to work that in probably with a few different macros or calculations. And, it's great and very cool that we get to the gallons of gasoline equivalent for the carbon, but we don't take it any further with this version of the calculator to look at social cost of carbon or other things that would bring us possibly to be able to talk the language in socioeconomic terms. And so I think that's a really important and exciting aspect to try to integrate in the future, because those economic aspects are very important to our work on a lot of different scales, ranging from very local to across the state. I hope that's given everybody a good background and summary of the work. Certainly thank you great thanks to Restore America's Estuaries and our partners at Wilcoit Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve. We also want to thank our friends at the Mission Aransas Research Reserve and the University of Texas who had us down to try to expand our minds, to roadshow this a little bit, but also expand our minds into thinking of how this tool might be made use of in other parts of the country.
And yeah, thanks, Nick. And just want a big shout out to Restore America's Estuaries in particular, and to Stephanie. Those guys have really raised the profile of blue carbon and made us think hard about how best to incorporate a lot of that thinking into our everyday work. So again, thank you, Restore America's Estuaries, for raising the profile and helping us think about it as an ecosystem service. And just one final note before we get to questions: our emails should have a period between our first name and last name. So it should be nick.wildman. And direct all your questions to Nick. He knows a lot more about this than I do. But make sure if you contact Nick or if you contact me that you put a period between our first and last names.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So thanks, Stephanie. We'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nick and Tim. We do have a few questions. We'll try to squeeze in the last few minutes here. You guys have how you could add in this carbon sequestration into the tool. And so there's a couple of questions that have come up about how difficult that might be, and also about adding in carbon storage capacity into the tool as well. If you could comment on that.
Yeah, let's maybe, do I still have control of the screen here?
Yes.
Okay, if we go back in to the Excel tool itself, you know, I think the most, well, it would really depend, and I bet you there's some Excel wizards out there that are probably quicker and faster at doing this than I would be. Probably the straightforward Flintstonian approach here would simply be to augment the lookup table with some of those factors. You'd want them to correspond with those land use types that you were most interested in, if not all of these. But I could see having that in another table here, and then having those tie in basically through the same mathematics that carry it through on these various tabs here, but to integrate those factors into the calculations that get spit out at this end. You know, I think that would work. I think what would also be more interesting to me is to build in those calculations again as more of a representative function of those dynamics that is not to be straight up linear in their outputs. Have you thought much about that, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges with a lot of this work is this trying to also think about both the sequestration and emissions with sea level rise. So the carbon storage is obviously going to change over time, and some of these wetlands are more vulnerable to sea level rise than others. And so there's a lot of questions that circle around. So how do you account for loss of salt marshes due to sea level rise, and what happens to that carbon? So it does raise all sorts of interesting questions vis-a-vis carbon storage and sequestration. I do think that what we need, and we struggled with when we looked at some of the carbon sequestration values for the Northeast, is finding enough information, just like with the emissions, enough sort of regionally specific data that we could draw upon. I think we took from both Rhode Island and Maine to help us with our sequestration values.
Yeah, that's right.
For our project in Hingham that I showed. But it is a really good question, and we would, I think, be looking to you to help us potentially see how we can incorporate that. So again, it's a very rough start. It's a first generation tool, but putting in the sequestration side would definitely make it much more dynamic.
And we have another question kind of as a follow-up to that, is do you or the DER have plans to maintain and update this going forward? And then as a caveat to that, is there a possibility to format and make it available via Google Sheets?
We haven't thought about that. I mean, the plan what we're really excited about, as Stephanie knows, is that we're going to get some very specific information from our Herring River project. So we do plan on putting those values in and updating those values. And so we're going to jump right from Tier 1 to Tier 3 as our Herring River information comes in. And part of that study, USGS is also looking at a bunch of other salt marshes on Cape Cod. So this tool should go from, basically 5 miles per hour to 50 miles per hour pretty quickly, again, for certain coastal wetland habitat types. But in terms of kind of converting it into more friendly Google format, we haven't really looked into that. I guess, our state systems are sort of built on the ever-present Microsoft format. So, but that's definitely something that I think we would encourage other users to help us with.
Okay, great. We're going to try to fit in a few more questions as they're coming in. So another question is, have you or do you plan to apply this calculator to eelgrass protection or restoration?
It's a great question. We, I think it'd be quite possible to do that. We don't actually, our division is not really actively involved in eelgrass at this time. Our colleagues at the Division of Marine Fisheries and other agencies here in the state are those who are most actively involved in monitoring and restoring that. So it's just an opportunity, I would say, to expand our partnerships and to take in some of that information and really understand how that world works. But
I mean, similar to mangroves, I know that Nick, you kind of plug those numbers in, and it didn't take that long based on the IPCC information. Similarly, my guess is you could do that for eelgrass, but
yep, and to do that, honestly, I'd look to expand the tool to some other functions, or excuse me, some other parameters that are more that may be affecting that, dealing with water chemistry and other things.
But I guess the sort of short answer is we realize that's a gap, it's a hole, and we also understand that there is tremendous potential around eelgrass restoration, and Massachusetts is engaging in it. We just didn't put it in.
Okay. Another question is about the emissions related to construction activities, and if that can be included in the tool.
I think that'd be excellent. We're right now in the final week of a project that has been over a year-long cranberry farm restoration in Plymouth, Massachusetts. I mean, we've had 1 or 2 machines working out at this site 5 days a week for about a year. And when I say machines, I mean large excavators, earth-moving, dump trucks and conveyors. We've had generators to run pumps to move water during critical stages. So there's definitely a carbon-intensive part of some of these activities. When some of our projects are very quick, removing small dams, removing small barriers, those can be accomplished within a week with a machine or 2. When we look at really large landscape level restorations, those can add up pretty quickly. And I know that just from our internal kind of thinking about it, there are online resources to estimate that based on the types of machines that you have working and the number of hours, etc. I think that would be, at least on a quote tier 1 level, referencing a tool like that, referencing the data from a source like that, you could incorporate that pretty easily.
And just to follow up on that, because that's a great question, I'm really interested in thinking too about the land use history of a former cranberry bog. Say, for example, right, if the cranberry bog is kept in production, what does that mean in terms of its greenhouse gas footprint? And as well, once these sites transition, again, Nick showed a site, a cranberry farm that we're transitioning to a sort of a complex mosaic of freshwater wetland sites, but in 150 years, it may transition into salt marsh, and then you start to see those methane levels go down, and you kind of, so what is the
sea level rise, right?
Yeah, yeah. What happens to a site over its long history, both in terms of its, the fossil fuel inputs for farming over a 50-year period, transition into land that's protected, restored, and then eventually shifts and transitions with sea level rise. These are really all fascinating questions, and the good news is that the calculator is like at least a footprint, or not a footprint, but it's a starting block for us to start to think about the overall impacts of a site. it over? Ah.
Great. Oh.
Sorry, we had one more question. Where can we go to get more information about the Herring River Restoration Project?
So if you go to our website, we have a link. So our website, how best to get there? You can just Google again, Mass Division of Ecological Restoration, or Mass DER. And on the right-hand side, we have all of our projects listed. And there is a sort of a map where you can click on Herring River out in Cape Cod and Wellfleet. And then also, if you go to the Friends of Herring River website, if you Google Friends of Herring River, there are many fact sheets. There's lots of information. There's lots of sort of history of the project, where we're going, what's our goals and aspirations for that project at the Friends of Herring River website, in addition to the information that we have on our website in our priority projects mapping tool that's again on our front page.
Great, thanks. We did have a couple of questions we didn't get to. For those folks, I can follow up with you after the webinar, or you can reach out to me, Tim, or Nick. Email's on the screen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Recording of this will be posted online, and you will receive a follow-up email, and we'll be sure to include some of the resources and websites that were mentioned on today's website or webinar as well. So thank you, Tim and Nick, for presenting today. This is a really interesting tool, and we look forward to see how it progresses and how it's used.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.